COVID lockdowns forced us all into exile from our churches and temples. Now we've returned only to find things aren't the same. If we're really honest, we still haven't recovered. In our case, the temple is the people, the ecclesia, and our temple is in tatters, lowered attendance, different faces every week, and we've lost our ability to community. But there's hope. Join us now as J. Oliver Glasgow and his guests explore a generation from 2 millennia ago that faced the same exact problem, being exiled in Babylon and returning only to find their temple in tatters, losing their ability to community. What can we learn? How can 6 books of the Hebrew Bible that chronicles the Lord's guidance and their choices transform our tattered temples today to better than they were before? This is Exile's Return.
The great king of Persia is on the throne. I pronounced it like Gerard Butler in the 300, Persia. He has just defeated Babylon, which means intentionally or unintentionally, he just liberated the Jews, satisfying a number of prophecies that they would be aware of. Some have returned to Jerusalem, found the temple in tatters. Shashbazzar is the Jewish governor. Ezra is documenting the scenes from afar, and for the first 6 chapters, likely as a matter of history. This is Exile's Return. I'm your host, J. Oliver Glasgow. We're joined in the studio today by our most excellent guest, Bible and military scholar and advisor, Jay Garza. Jay, the listeners have read the chapter and hopefully our accompanying devotional from Exile's Return, which everyone can find at shalomdfw.care/exile. Let's start with an interesting piece of trivia. How do you pronounce the name of the king of Persia?
That's a great question. I like the straightforward Cyrus.
Cyrus is, I think virtually everybody says that. I recently had a Jewish scholar tell me it was Kyrus.
Correct.
Because it's Persia.
Right.
All right. I should totally get the Gerard Butler points for that. I think I'm close to it. I do that better than Bond with Miss Moneypenny. Many feel that Cyrus, mentioned by Isaiah by name and alluded to by Jeremiah, was this same Kyrus. What say you?
Of course. I think when you look at the history and the way he became king, you look at the prophecies about how that was going to happen. And you know, as you know, have a military background, the way he overcame the city of Babylon. The history there is just amazing, right? So a walled city, typical for that time, right? You bring your armies against it, but Babylon was built in such a way that they had water, the rivers ran through it, they had provisions, right? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, famous for, throughout scripture. And so they really weren't worried. As a matter of fact, they were having a party that night, right? As the army camps outside. And so what does Kyrus or Cyrus do? Well, he diverts the rivers, the water flow, right? And he marches his army through the riverbed right into the city. And as predicted, the gates would be open.
Yeah.
Right? And he comes right in almost without a fight that night. So to answer that question, yeah, absolutely. It was part of the prophecy.
So he defeats a neighboring enemy, Babylon, gates wide open. What would lead a conquering king to look at a group of exiles there and kind of go overboard with restitution?
Right. Well, I think if we open up Ezra and Nehemiah, the very first opening sentence, right, it kind of gives you that background where it says Cyrus was moved by the God of heaven. Right? And then he goes, whoever of the people want to return, this same God of heaven has instructed me to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. And whoever amongst you wants to go back, you're free to do it.
Right. Now, God let the Jews of that time in on his plan, restoring the temple through Isaiah and Jeremiah more than 100 years before this event. By name, right? He mentions Kyrus.
Correct.
That means God had a plan to restore the temple after exile. Does he have a plan to restore our temple after COVID exile?
That's a really good question, a really good analogy. So let's take the historical aspect first, and let's go back to the people and their return. This goes back all the way to Deuteronomy 30, right? So what happens in Deuteronomy 30 is Moses warns the people, right? You have the curses and the blessings. And if you choose life, right? Of course, he knew it wouldn't happen.
So, by the way, that's the simplest multiple choice test ever given, right? I set before you today a choice, life or death. And
correct.
By the way, the right answer is life.
Yeah, choose life. And he even says that, right? So it's a key. Choose life. But I think God in his providence already knew that there would come a time when the people would not honor the covenant, they would rebel against him, they would commit idolatry, right? And then he would remove them from the land. And it even says that in Deuteronomy. But there's also a promise. If, when you're removed from the land and you're captive among the nations, right? If you turn to me, I will bring you back. So the promise was even there way back historically in Deuteronomy. And the people knew this. So back to context, they're aware of the Deuteronomy 30. They're aware of Jeremiah's prophecies. And now they're getting a chance to return. So the second part of your question is there analogies with what we're going through today, right? With the COVID return. And I think there are. I think what we have found during COVID is that it was much easier to attend service by turning on the tube, right? Well, and for all the right reasons, let's just say that, right? We wanted to minimize contact between people and the social interactions that might lead to contamination. But I think what happens is people become used to something, right? You got used to that. Well, it's so much easier, right? I can just turn on the TV and I can watch from here, from the comfort of my own home. I don't have to go to church.
You know, this is historical. We're going to see this in about 20 chapters in our study, that before exile, as they were being taken into exile, there were people that were escaping. Jeremiah got taken prisoner, I believe, to Egypt.
Correct.
And there was a group in that splinter group that formed a little commune on an island called Elephantine. Correct. And they built a temple.
Temple there, correct.
Right? And some of those people got captured and taken to Babylon. So the stories permeated. And a lot of scholars feel this is where they got the idea for a synagogue, which is, we can't make it to Jerusalem. We're too far away. So let's build a little place here. It's like a TV set. They invented the internet before the internet, right? Was remote worship.
Right. Many of us in reading the Bible don't question, like in Jesus' time, you got all these different groups vying for power, right? You got the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and no one questions, where did these groups start?
Right.
Right? And how did they come into power? And you're absolutely right. So what happened is you no longer have a temple to worship. So what do? You got to create a synagogue somewhere, which is nothing more than a place of meeting where you can come together and you can read the Torah and you can worship God. And so, yeah, that was their fix around it.
And they had the exact same problem that we're having, is that people got used to it and would not come back to Jerusalem. And we see a call later in this study for them to come back, right? There is a lot of analogies to what they went through to what we're going through, almost day for day, right?
Right. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind, and it touches on a lot of the cultural things that are going on during exile. One is the loss of identity. Okay, so you no longer have a temple. That's part of your identity. Going to Jerusalem 3 times a year to worship, even if you didn't live there. And so what begins to happen to a people's identity when they're taken out of the land? And what we find is, this is 70 years later now, almost 2 complete generations. And so how much of Babylon had creeped into them by this point?
Absolutely. If you're away from your temple and you're doing the remote worship thing, you may have been a contributor in doing works in your temple. Now you're a contributor. You're supporting with a tithe or an offering. But if you go back before the exile, there were people that were doing the work and there were people that were giving offerings. Now the roles could reverse or they could change. They could just be all offering. So as we come back, do we have to relearn what we were doing before? What was my role before? Because, I've just been farming that out.
Well, I think this gives us an opportunity to really look at what are those roles. Why is it only a remnant come back? Okay? Because you ask yourself, and obviously Ezra and Nehemiah goes through extreme means to try to identify exactly who was returning, right, in that first wave that came back. But that's certainly a very small piece of Judah and a very small piece of Israel as a whole that came back. And so the other question is, okay, what roles do we take now that we're back?
That's exactly right. Well, to get us there, just from this one chapter, first chapter of Ezra, we have 5 big takeaways for everyone this chapter. Things that we can learn from their rebuilding effort that we can apply right now to our rebuilding effort. First, pray for our leader or patron, our Kyrios, whoever that is, to be granted favor. We need to take an inventory of everything we lost during our exile, including the jobs we were doing. Pray for our Kyrios that God would already be stirring them up. You mentioned that earlier. Set up a framework for both workers and supporters to know what their roles are. And consider a homecoming of sorts, an event to return all the inventory to the temple. For our last question today, I saw a bumper sticker once that said, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plan.
Well, it's really interesting. I don't mean to come out of just the first chapter alone, but because Ezra and Nehemiah are built around themes more so than chapters, right? So the theme is this is the first attempt to get back to the land, right? And so the first thing they have to do is reestablish the altar, right? Why do they reestablish the altar? Well, because the altar is key to worship.
I'm going to pause you right there because we're going to leave our listeners in suspense. Because we're going to answer that question, not the next podcast, but the one right after it. And we want people to stay tuned. So in closing, Jay, in reflecting on what we talked about in our last podcast about mental illness that maybe all of us are going through to one degree or another, what can simply knowing that God has a plan for us today do to help a very serious mental health issue that we all face, whether we realize it or not?
Well, I think before we address the part of comfort in knowing that God has a plan, it's important to first recognize that we are battling mental illness at large, right? That the COVID and everything that came with it did impact us on a personal level, on a family level, and then building on that on a church level. So we need to recognize that and really ask ourselves, how much of an impact was that? And how did I cope with it? So let's be honest about the effects first. We know and trust, just like the people of Israel knew and trusted that God had a plan. They were dependent on the prophecies. They knew that there was prophecies about the return. And so we know that God has a plan. I don't think that's something that anyone who considers himself a Christian needs to doubt. No matter what you're going through, God has a plan. The difficult part comes in the middle of the storm. While you're going through it, how do you trust in that plan? Right? Because we talk about trauma, and we talked about how it affects people. And so one of the effects of trauma is that you lose hope. Right? You can't see past where you're at. You can't see past the storm that you're going through. And so there's this loss of hope. So how do you regain that?
Another brilliant tease for the next podcast. We are going to go into that. Jay Garza, thank you very much for joining us again. It was a pleasure. And to you listening, thank you for joining us. God's mercy and direction are just a prayer away. Shalom.
You can read along each week with the materials you'll find at shalomdfw.care/exile. Join us next time as J. Oliver Glasgow and his guests think through our next chapter in Exile's Return. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast, and join the online conversation at shalomdfw.care. I'm Kurt Booten. Thanks for listening.